If you're at the back, can you put your hands up? That means you can hear me. Brilliant. Thank you. Don't you hate it when people say, if you're at the back, can you hear me at the back? Because if they can't hear you, how are they going to know? How are you going to know? So, good afternoon. Is everyone enjoying Selenium Conference? Yeah? I've been really inspired by a few things today. For anyone that doesn't know me, that's me. I've done a few things. I've been actually off the conference circuit for a while. But I used to run this website called Testing Reflections. For the older ones among you might have known that. And I've contributed to various books, including some of the ones there. And I came off the conference circuit for about 3 years, mainly because my son decided to take up a very time-consuming hobby and decided to go semi-pro as a racing driver, which left me with zero time other than earning money and taking him to racetracks and answering his phone calls and chauffeuring him everywhere. But hopefully you'll see a little bit more from me in the near future. Probably, because I've done this is my third conference in about 5 days. So, now that I have a bit more time. Anyway, so I was really inspired by Simon's talk this morning. He had a particular thing that he said. Can anyone remember what it was about code, his opinion on code? Yeah. And I was thinking about that, and I really wanted to incorporate it. And I thought, well, what does that really mean? I mean, that could mean anything. And, is it seriously hindered in testing? Sometimes, yeah. I think in some testing teams, we heard Simon's story about handing a tester who'd never done any programming before the responsibility of writing all the test automation code. Now, that's not fair, so we need knowledge of programming in what we do. And if we start out without that programming, it's great that we have a community around us that we're willing to step in and help. And I love that story that Simon told. What else? Seriously hindered in translation. So, are we expressing the intent of what we're trying to achieve with our tests? Is that coming across clearly in our code? And I want to try and answer that a little bit today. And is it seriously hindered in transformation? So how easy is our code to refactor? I came up with that today, would you believe? Anyway, a little word of warning. No, Simon didn't give me a heads up. A little word of warning, though. One of the things that I see often is when we're trying to automate testing, people talk about the testing pyramid. And what I want to talk to you about today is for the kinds of tests where we are actually interacting through all the layers of the application. So this is an old-fashioned calculator. It's got the display, it's got the keypad, it's got the old ticker reel where it prints out things. Then it's got another layer which handles the actual computation, and that's all at the bottom. And there are separate components that handle different aspects of the computation in this old-fashioned calculator. And a lot of our software is componentized in this way and layered in this way. And what I want to suggest that when you are writing these tests end-to-end, and if you are looking at the pattern that I'm going to talk to you a bit about today, I hope you're not trying to test every single possible scenario through every single layer of the product. Because generally speaking, it's not practical to do that. So I can point you back to the testing pyramid that came up earlier. Anyway, so I'm going to talk to you about the Screenplay pattern, but I just want to put one more disclaimer, and that is it's a way of separating any kind of interaction between your tests and the product that you're trying to interact with. So it can be used for RESTful APIs as well as WebDriver, page objects, and so on. But today, I really want to focus on page objects. Anyone here worked with page objects before? I was expecting that. No surprise there. Okay. So let's just take a really basic application, web app in this case. It's a to-do list manager. So I can put some to-dos in there. I have to remember to walk the dog, wash the car, order the new MacBook Pro or not. I'm not so sure at the moment, given the price tag. And just a very simple application. So if we had a page object, that page object is generally sort of set up in such a way that we have the elements that we want to interact with and the tasks that we might do on that page. Is that consistent with your understanding? Anyone disagree? I'm seeing nodding heads. That's good. Okay. So in a simple way. So let's go back in time to understand a little bit about where page objects came from. So this guy called Simon Stewart, who I saw walking in a minute ago, wrote a blog post back in 2009. Now, what was happening at the time, Selenium and I think WebDriver at the time as well, people were starting to use tools like this, and they were having all sorts of reliability problems with their tests. Oh, Selenium's rubbish, it doesn't work. You get kind of feedback like that. Bug reports coming in saying, oh, it doesn't work in this way. But what was actually happening is people were writing their tests in a way that wasn't sustainable or maintainable. There was duplication in their tests. So eventually, this particular blog post had to be written just to explain the problem isn't with the framework, the problem is with how we were writing tests. The code itself was not of a good enough quality to be maintainable, and as a result, people were having issues with how they were using Selenium, not with Selenium itself. So one of the things, I'd love to tell you the original version of the story of how Simon explained to me what it was that motivated him to do this. But I'd like to, but we were in a pub, and I'm pretty sure it was several beers later, and your memory is way better than mine. But basically, I think he said words along the lines of, this morning, all the code is shit, and we've got to stop it. We had to stop it. So I had to come up with something that was easily adoptable, made sense, and kept people out of trouble for as long as possible. And that's where page objects came from. Now, let's consider just, your most very basic kind of page object example. Again, ways of interacting with, ways of finding elements and the task we might do on it. Now, I went trawling around the internet. This was one of the, well, not the whole internet, just GitHub. And this was one of the examples that I found. And if we zoom out, it kind of ends up looking like this. Now, I'm sure no one in this room has any page objects that look anything like that when you zoom out. So there's a few people like, oh. Okay. I'm sure we've all written code like this at some point in our careers, so don't feel judged in any way. What's wrong with it?
It's too long. It's not readable. It's not maintainable.
Well, part of the reason it's not readable is because I had to zoom out, so the writing's really small. Sorry. Yeah, so has anyone heard the term code smell before as a way of describing problems that we see in code or smell in the code, depending on what your sensory preference is? Okay, so if we were going to talk about a code smell, does anyone know like any of the named sort of code smells or anti-patterns for code that's obvious with? It's not obvious that it's duplicated, but there's a really good chance that there is duplication in there. But the code smell relating to this is the thing that tells us there probably is duplication. Does anyone know what it's called? It's really easy. It's called large class. Okay, that's some Java code, large class. And when you have a large class, what happens? People think, oh, this is the right place to put the thing, scroll, can't find it, add the new method. And then you end up with a whole bunch of duplication. People are laughing, and I know because you've done it, right? We all have at some point, when you've got pressure, you make it happen. So if you have that, what do you do next? What can you do? You can split it, yeah? So Martin Fowler's way of describing page objects is not that they are objects representing a page, they are page objects, as in objects on the page, for example. So that's one way we might split them up, for example. Okay? But there are some key principles that can really guide us in how to handle this particular problem. And one of those is a set of object-oriented design principles called solids. Anyone heard of those? Yeah. So they came from Michael Feathers and Robert Martin. And they talked a little bit about what are the sort of key obvious principles that we should really look for in our code that makes it more maintainable. And they came up with this particular acronym. And we haven't got time to go into this, partly because I thought it was a 45-minute talk, and I just found out it was 35. So we're only going to look at these two specific examples: the single responsibility principle and the open-close principle. Now, the first one's easy. Who wants to tell me that one?
Class should only do one thing.
A class should only do one thing. Absolutely. Pretty straightforward. Yeah? What about the open-closed principle? Anyone know that one? Tougher one, isn't it? The open-closed principle tells us that a class should be open for extension but closed for modification. So what that essentially means is that we should be able to extend the behavior of a product by writing a new class and adding it without changing any code that already works. So if you want to add functionality and you find yourself changing a class to add that functionality, that means that it doesn't satisfy the open-closed principle. But if you can write a new class without changing anything else and add it, and it just works, that's the open-closed principle. To take it to the extreme, in theory, if you have an application that's deployed, let's say it's in Java, you've got jars, or in Ruby, you've got gems, it should be possible to write a new Java class or a new Ruby module or class and put that out in a new jar file or a new gem, and the application should just have the new functionality as a result. That's taking the principle to the extreme. So you shouldn't have to change anything that's already deployed. Now, we're not going to take it to the extreme, but we are going to listen to these two principles, partly because the two people that sort of helped highlight them as valuable I respect, at least in terms of their code and various other reasons. So let's take a look at what that means in the real world. So back to our app, to-do app. Simple things, add to-dos, mark them as complete, that sort of thing. And we talked about a page object that might represent that. I don't want to have all of the code here because no one will be able to read anything. But again, we've got how to find the page elements and how a user completes a given task. What was the S in solid? Single responsibility principle. How many responsibilities can we see?
4.
4, interesting. Why?
I thought responsibility per function.
Per function, quite possibly. Wow, you just jumped ahead. So there's at least 2, how we find stuff and how a user what tasks a user might perform on that page. But it actually might be even more. There might be 1 responsibility for each of those individual tasks. But before we jump ahead, so let's have a think about how we could break this page object up. So we're all familiar with the term refactoring, which means to change the internal design without changing the external behavior. And there are some named refactoring steps that we can take. One of them is extract class. So we can extract a class for one responsibility and extract a class for another responsibility. But then we've got this dependency between these two. So this one's always going to be looking in there all the time. But also, maybe there are more than one responsibility. When I look at this, I'm thinking, ooh, maybe each of these is a responsibility in its own right. And another thing that could lead me to start thinking about that is maybe this class is still quite large. What is a large class, by the way? What do you think is a large class?
You have to scroll.
I don't know. I've got this colleague. He's got this huge screen that he turns that way. And he has this font size that you pretty much have to be a fighter pilot to be able to read. So I'm not sure about scrolling as a great rule. It used to work when we had like 80 characters wide and about 100 tall, but not now. So James Lewis, one of the guys quite famous for talking about microservices, he likes to say that a class should be no bigger than his head. I don't think his head's that big, so I think that's reasonable. I think we all use our heads as a rough guide. I wouldn't say go up to the screen like this, Just a rough guide, okay? Right, so maybe it's still a large class. So maybe we can consider some other refactorings. Maybe we can still do extract class, but maybe we can group things differently. Maybe we can group things based on the kinds of things that we're doing. So we're adding to-dos, we're maintaining the to-dos, so this has got a couple of tasks in it, but then this is kind of mixing responsibilities again. So maybe I'm not so sure about that. And again, maybe this one ends up being a bit too big. So there's another named refactoring that we can use, which is replace method with method object. Yeah? So where you extract a single method out to a single class. Has anyone taken that step before? You have a single method behavior. Has anyone used any APIs that kind of get you to create a single class. Can anyone name one of those? Quite a well-known one. Anyone use Java? Hang on, one person uses Java here, really? You are so lucky. Oh, there's a few, okay. Okay, so if you've used JUnit and you've used Hamcrest assertions, where it goes assert that something is equal to, the equal to method is creating an instance of a matcher. It's not actually matching anything. And then what it does is it provides you an interface where the assert that calls a matches safely method, passing in the value. So it's not actually doing anything other than creating an instance of the behavior, but then you have to actually call the thing for it to have that behavior. Part of the reason that it does that is because at the time when it was written, and still now really, Java didn't have functions as first-class types. If you're lucky enough to be working with a language that has functions as first-class types, you probably kind of do this stuff all the time. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. But this is another way of extracting things out. So there's one other problem, though. One other thing that was like really, really kind of bugging me working with some page objects. And it was a question about what are we modeling? When we're writing a page object, what domain are we modeling? And it all kind of clicked for me, again, back in 2007. And that's me in the top left there. You can just kind of see a little bit of my old ponytail there before I cut my hair. And there's a few other people in here. Does anyone recognize anyone in this picture? If you can see it. There's a few other people. This was the first Agile Alliance functional test tools workshop. And they had Jim Shaw, did the art of Agile. Pekka Clark did the robot framework. Ben Simo, Elizabeth Hendrickson, Janit Andrea. Jeremy Mazzaro's ex-unit test patterns. Ward Cunningham, being totally Ward, like totally meta, taking a picture of the person, taking the picture of us. And Naresh Jain up there. So there's a whole group of us kind of got together, because at the time we were a bit frustrated with like some of the tooling that was available at the time. And there's a guy called Kevin Lawrence, who's there in the blue T-shirt at the back with the sunglasses on. And he started talking about user-centered design. And in user-centered design, as well as other things, this concept called task analysis is used. And in task analysis, you think about how someone gets something done by looking at the tasks they perform and how they perform them. So when you're looking at this, particularly in UCD, you have roles. So who's this for? Goals, why are they here and what outcome do they hope to achieve? Tasks, so what are they doing? And actions, how are they doing it? Does that make sense? Seems pretty straightforward. An action would be something like click here, type this into that field, tap, swipe. Those are actions. Think interactions, if it helps. The task is what you're doing. So if I needed someone to, turn the volume up on the microphone, for example, don't actually do that. If I wanted someone to turn the volume up on the microphone, I wouldn't say, reach forward, touch the volume knob, turn 12 degrees to the right. I wouldn't say that. I'd say, could you turn it up a bit? And that's it. You say what you're doing, not how. And I think what happens in many of our tests when we're using many frameworks is we get so hung up on the how that we forget what the user's trying to do and why they're trying to do it. And I really found that this particular framework was quite useful this particular model was quite useful at helping me think about it. And that evening, I hacked together an example of the first thing that I now call Screenplay, and I'll explain why in a little while. Because it took my thinking away from the application, the solution, the implementation. I thought maybe I shouldn't be modeling the implementation. Maybe I should be modeling what the user is trying to achieve. Maybe I should be modeling what they're doing and how they're doing it. And maybe that will get me thinking differently about how I write my tests. So I've got an example where it kind of hooks into Cucumber, and I've got another one with JUnit. I'll just show you this. So here's how that kind of maps into the real world. So for the roles, who? So if you have a persona, or if you have a particular role that you're thinking about, in this example, it's a pet clinic receptionist. Goal, why are they doing what they're doing? So in this particular case, we're talking about finding all pet owners, by default when you search. And the tasks are what are they doing? So they're searching for owners with the search terms. That's what they're doing. But how they do it will then involve them entering the search terms into the search terms text box, clicking the button, and then waiting to see what happens next. So there's that distinction between what someone's doing and how, between the declarative, the what, and the imperative, the how. So this kind of got me thinking also about, well, who would play a role? Any ideas? What name would you give to somebody that plays a role? An actor. Exactly. And different actors have different skills or abilities. In this particular case, I decided to call this actor James. And this example is using something called using the Serenity framework, Serenity BDD. They've actually implemented an interpretation of the Screenplay pattern into that framework, which I've actually used on client side, which worked very well for us. And James can have one or more abilities. In this case, he just has the ability to browse the web. And all that's doing is just wrapping up WebDriver. So we talk about abstracting away the specific details of what's doing the interactions. And that allows us to replace things like that with factory methods that can just load up the appropriate implementation that we require. The actors can perform tasks. So James can attempt to add a to-do item on our to-do app, such as buying milk. And this is what I was saying. This thing here is not actually doing anything yet. It's creating an instance of the add a to-do item task configured with buy some milk. So if you've used Hamcrest, you'll have seen this kind of way of writing code before. And then what happens, that the attempts to then calls the perform as method and then visits the task and says, all right, now I'm going to follow the instructions in this task. So the instructions would then be actions. So this is the add a to-do item class. That's pretty much it. And in here, the actor attempts to, and now they can actually perform each of the specific interactions. Now this is an older, slightly older example, but you actually pass in a series of interactions. So hitting return is actually a separate interaction rather than a chained one. I heard someone say earlier today, oh, trouble with Fluent APIs is you always have to chain, but you don't. In fact, some of the best Fluent APIs, you don't chain. You tend to be passing in instances of things, or you pass in functions that can interact with each other. Does that make sense so far? Is anyone confused? Has anyone got a question at this point? Make sense? Okay. Now, the things that the actions interact with really, at this point, just become data, just ways of finding things. There's a colleague of mine called Andy Palmer who has a really cool concept called robot handles. And I think the talk is available from Selenium Conf India. So I do encourage you to check that out, where he talks about how you can actually infer the strategy for interacting with something. So you just say, if you have an app that if you have an app that allows you to choose, I don't know, services from a spa, you should be able to just say, well, I want to choose the deep tissue massage. But you shouldn't have to say how you choose that. You shouldn't have to say if it's a radio button. You shouldn't have to say if it's a drop-down list or a free text field. We should be able to infer that from the application, load the appropriate strategy for the interaction, and then do it. For the purposes of today, I don't want to go into that because that takes a whole 35, 40 minutes to explain on its own. So I'm just going to show you just a place that, in this example, we put that data. It doesn't have to be there. It could be anywhere. It could be in a JSON file, however you want to keep that data. So these are just the things we interact with. Now, the key difference, instead of a few large classes, what you do end up with is lots of smaller ones. So if you're working with Java, what you end up with is sort of neatly separated classes. But with modern IDEs, they can pretty much go and find the stuff that you want. You start typing it. You can almost, when I use IntelliJ, sometimes I feel like it's reading my mind. Like I just reach for the keyboard and it says, oh, do you want to say this? I'm like, oh, yeah, okay, yep. It practically writes the code for me. And it works just as well with separated classes as it does when you have the dot operator. The dot operator, in many ways, constrains us. It says, here's all you can do. whereas the tasks are, well, here's the kind of thing you can do. Now, because of this, what we end up doing is we end up modeling not the solution we've implemented, but the thing that the user's trying to do. And when you identify something new that the user wants to do, the what do they want to do, the task? Do I have to change any classes? What would I do next? Just write a new one and drop it in. Hence the open-closed principle. And the great thing about that is I can still reuse other classes. So if I have an add a to-do item and I have the need to add more than one to-do item, I can create a to-do items class that can be configured with a list of to-do items, and then it just iterates over calling that same task again as you would with a method. But everything is then kept completely separate, neat. And then if any functionality changes, you tend to be changing it in one place. The other thing about this is that if your UI changes in some key way, some fundamental way that forces you to restructure your page objects, has anyone kind of found themselves in that situation where you've had, was it really easy? Yeah, it was easy? Cool. I think it's even easier with this. And I'm gonna suggest why, but you could prove me wrong. So, how many people have page objects that inherit from other page objects? Most of us. Okay, so this other great little snippet of insight someone gave me some years ago, which is that we favor composition over inheritance. When we have composition, inheritance is no longer in your way. So you don't have to worry about what side effects you might have having inherited from another class. And then when you've identified duplication, you can then avoid having to pull all of that duplication up into that parent class because the duplication just sits in these separate tasks. And if the application does change in some fundamental way, it will usually be how the user achieves a particular outcome, which generally will mean you might have to change one or two tasks, not the entire structure of the application. Because if I have let's say I have the to-do list, and for whatever reason, somebody says, well, it'd be much better if the way you added to-dos was like a little wizard type thing for whatever reason. As long as after I've added the to-do, it doesn't matter to me whether it loads underneath or it loads a new page to show me the to-do or takes me somewhere else. As long as when I try to interact with the next thing that I asked for, it's there. It doesn't matter whether it was on that page or another page. But what can happen is when things start moving around, it's the same element, but you're now moving it to a different page or a different view or a different widget. If you're lucky enough to be working in teams where you have influence over what the IDs are on these things, then the ID can stay the same. It doesn't matter where it is. So you have far less need to change the actual code when the UI changes. And that, for me, is one of the main benefits. But yet again, going back to the open-close principle, the great thing is we just add a new task class. Now, I gave this talk the other week, and I added this slide in. I added the Cucumber slides in because I was doing this at the BDD Exchange. But you can also do this without Cucumber. You can use JUnit or any XUnit framework, depending on what language you're working with. The same principles apply. If anyone's interested in seeing a way of doing this with metaprogramming in Ruby, if you look on the Riverglide GitHub, there's an old example of it called Cuc Salad, which shows you how to kind of do this with quite a nice little DSL. In this particular example, it's still, again, a Fluent API. The given that, when, then are just sugar methods around James. They just give you back the same actor that you passed it. It's just some people like to write that in some of their tests. Some people don't. You don't have to do that. You can just say James attempts to, and then give it a list of tasks. Now, there is one special kind of task, and that's a question. And this one here is a question because it can tell us something that we want to know. So if we want to know what items were displayed, we ask that question. And in this particular implementation, we're using ham-crest matchers to see if the items displayed has the item milk, but that's just a regular out-of-the-box ham-crest matcher. Some people sort of challenge the wording of some of these method names, but I'll let you know that they've been very, very carefully thought through so that the names of the tasks can always be in the present tense. So you don't have to have James has started with an empty to-do list, but then if you want to start with an empty to-do list or add a to-do item, you don't have to say James has added an empty to-do item. You just say James was able to add a to-do item, or you can say James attempts to add a to-do item. So that's pretty much it. And the last piece of the puzzle for me was actually earlier this year when I was working with some colleagues of mine who were doing the implementation in Serenity, and with my colleague Andy Palmer. And we were talking about what is this? Because a friend of ours said, I'll just call it the journey pattern. It's like talking about the journey of the actor. And I thought, there's something missing there. And we were talking about it. We said, well, the scenario is like a narrative, almost like a script. And it's for a cast of actors, because that's what we keep talking about. And because we have separate actors, we can support multiple actors. So James can do something, Nicole could do something, Franzi can do something, and Jim can do something. You can have many different actors, each doing different things independently of each other, and each one ends up being a wrapper around their own instance of a browser, for example. So we thought about each actor can then be playing a different role, and each actor has the task of performing actions to the best of their abilities, and that's where we kind of came up with the screenplay pattern. Word of warning. If you're thinking about trying this, if any of you have watched this and thought, oh, actually, that looks all right, I think I'm going to use that, please don't. Not straight away. Anytime you come to a conference, there's one thing I'll always tell you, and I learned this the hard way if you haven't learned it yourself. Anytime you go to a conference, you see a great idea, always do an experiment first. See if it helps. See what you learn from doing it. Don't try to aim to refactor everything in this way. And in fact, the refactoring steps that I gave you at the beginning were more about trying to help you refactor your thinking about page objects, not actually refactor your page objects. Instead, what I'd say at the start, just consider writing something completely clean and fresh that interacts with the application that you already have, something that you know you're familiar with. And just do that as an experiment. Hopefully, some of you will have time where you can do experiments, and then see what you learn. See how it feels. And then if you think, yes, this is better for what we're trying to do, then what you can start looking at is, okay, for any new tests that we write, we'll try taking this approach separately, and bit by bit you might find that you'll be able to gradually move over from your old way of doing things to the new. And I'd give you that piece of advice in anything that you learn at any conference about anything. So I'm not saying don't use it, I'm saying try it if you like it, keep learning more, and then keep it if it works for you. So, in summary, so any code that we have that supports our tests, if it is getting too much to handle, sometimes I'd ask, a bit like that calculator example, are we testing too much through every layer of the application? Should we really be testing this many variations through every layer of the stack? And if you think about it, if I can plug some electrodes into the component on the calculator and fire in really, really fast calculations and check that the answers are right, once I put the keyboard on top, do I have to do all of those tests again, or do I just have to make sure that we have the main basic usage scenarios flowing through our app? Now, of course, that depends on how much visibility you have of the unit testing that's being done or how much involvement you have, but just do bear that in mind. Secondly, big classes with interaction methods like page objects are very, very useful as training wheels. They're a place to start. But when you do see them grow, when you see inheritance hierarchies get deeper and deeper and the sizes of the classes get larger, I do encourage you, take a step back, and if you haven't done so already, do look at some of the rich materials that are out there around object-oriented design, or if you're using a functional language, functional languages, and have a think about how you can start separating that code out in a way that makes sense. But do keep in mind that question, are you modeling the implementation or the problem you're trying to solve? Because the thing with training wheels is we try to go faster, they actually make us less stable. They actually make us slower. We kind of wobble a little bit. And it's only when we take the training wheels off that we can actually go as fast as we're capable of going. And the screenplay pattern is a way of allowing us to ride a little bit faster because we've taken the training wheels of page objects off. I hope you found that talk interesting. Thank you very much. I only found out 2 minutes before that I had to shave 10 minutes off my talk, and I don't know how I did that, but thank you very much for your help. 2 minutes for questions. Any questions? Concerns? Compliments? Thank you.
If there are same page elements being used, then even then you are suggesting to move them to a different class? The methods using the same page elements.
What I would do is say, if you bind the element to that page, if that element moves to a different page in the application, you then have to mirror that change in your tests, which means that you have to change things in 2 places. So it's like the testing equivalent of repeating yourself. So what I'd say is, if you can express, you need an abstraction that gives you a name versus the actual way you locate the element. In the example I gave, it happened to sit in a class as a constant. It doesn't have to. You can put those into a JSON file and just use text based arguments to then load up the correct locator, or you can put them in constants or an enum or whatever you like. But what I'd say is try to separate the way the application looks in the real world from the structure that you have for it in your tests, because what's more important is that you can do this thing, unless what you're testing is the structure, and that's a different thing. But if you are testing the structure of a UI, then usually that's much better done from within the unit tests of that UI, rather than testing, can it do the things that my customer wants it to do? Can we make sure it doesn't do the things they don't want it to do? That's the kind of level at which I'm kind of thinking about this. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Thank you.
Any other questions? There's a question over here with the chap with the grey hoodie. Is it a compliment? No? Oh, because if it wasn't, I was going to say, oh, we're out of time, I'm sorry.
It was great. Oh, can you hear me all right? It was a great talk, thank you. When you're using multiple actors in a given test, are there any pitfalls there? Does it get quite complicated, and when should you stop with the complexity?
The simple answer to that is keep it short, keep it simple. Because if your test is that complicated, you're probably testing more than one thing. And I'd aim to separate the tests out into the specific things that you're trying to prove, and then look for ways of removing duplication by being able to reset the browser and reuse it without having to start all over again, for example. But in my experience, most of my tests are at most 10 lines long. Anything more than that, and I have to ask myself, what am I testing? How many things am I testing? Let's just separate out into the separate goals. If we go back to the concept of having a goal for each scenario, if that's the name, then it makes sense. Anyway, we're out of time. Thank you very much. I'm around for the rest of today, and hope to see you